I'd just like to start by echoing the congratulations to the Dialogue Society journal members and the Dialogue Society for organizing this conference and the issue at this time. It's much needed, and it's been a pleasure to work with Mustafa and also to reconnect with Professor Weller and other colleagues. So thank you all for your work, and to the speakers and my fellow panelists. I really look forward to hearing and listening to your presentations. I was tasked with writing about gender and diaspora, and I'm aware that the first keynote this morning was from the Global South and looking specifically at Southeast Asia. So this is very much about the view from Britain. During the pandemic, we have had several stories that have grabbed our attention about exclusions, social injustice, and inequalities amongst communities across the world. Research from Public Health England and City Hall, as well as other independent research from universities, has shown that Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities were affected disproportionately by the virus. When it comes to Muslim communities in the UK, there is a recognition through data that there are inequalities embedded in the system that affect groups in different ways, from housing, transport to homeschooling. The communities are diverse and many have come under greater pressure during Eid festivals and Ramadan. Vaccine hesitancy has become a hurdle in the race to fight the virus, and community responses are varied, highlighting barriers of race, class, and gender. What the pandemic has shown is that communities are central to city infrastructures, and it has also laid bare problems of access and structural inequalities when it comes to public health. So in this moment of national and global crisis, levels of intercultural trust and dialogue can serve as means of building communities. And in my paper, I'll consider some political and media-based occurrences that have put Muslim communities in the spotlight and how this might affect their relationships with dialogue across and between groups and with the state and civil society. So in the midst of the pandemic, we've had the long-awaited independent review of Islamophobia in the Conservative Party last month, which has found evidence of discrimination and anti-Muslim sentiment when it came to Boris Johnson's comments comparing Muslim women wearing the burqa to letterboxes, and the dog whistle campaign that was run by Zach Goldsmith against Sadiq Khan in his first mayoral election. In the final analysis, the report cleared the Tory party of institutional racism when it comes to how complaints have been dealt with. However, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson's expression of regret at offence caused by his phrasing barely conceals a significant number of instances where party members, candidates, and local councillors were much less reticent about articulating their prejudice. Baroness Saida Warsi has expressed her dissatisfaction with the report, calling it a whitewash. Paltry punishments such as temporary suspensions do nothing to dispel the idea that the party has a problem with one of Britain's largest minority communities, an image compounded by Johnson's own prior assertion that Islam has put the Muslim world centuries behind the West. Now, the idea that Muslims tend to be stereotyped is nothing new. Edward Said, for example, gave a good account of this process in his 1981 book covering Islam, and others have written about these problems in things like Hollywood movies. The fact that this is an ongoing issue is evidenced by Riz Ahmed's latest intervention and the Riz test as a means of ensuring that there is better representation of Muslims in Hollywood. However, what Peter Morey and I noticed was that the comparative consistency of this message, if we can call it that, crossed the boundaries of different media and public discourses. Political policies and initiatives around citizenship and civil rights were just as likely to operate on an assumed otherness of Muslim subjects as were TV dramas, films, or tabloid newspapers. So using the various grammars of different discursive forms, such texts operated to frame Muslims to construct a box or frame within which all those valorized themes, fundamentalism, female oppression, terrorism, and a suspicious allegiance to the transnational ummah, could be contained and repeated. They then became the legitimating set of assumptions about Muslims, forming the frame in which all utterances had to be recognized as relevant. So Islam is monolithic, and threatening, and Muslims themselves are always defined by their membership of a larger collectivity with some mysterious power to sap the individual's will and furnish them with an approved set of attitude and beliefs. In our work, we began to explore these frames, searching out what they have in common and examining them for the inevitable inconsistencies and contradictions that always go along with attempts to boil down the complexity of human individuals and social groups. In our book, we critically analysed a number of these recurring yet reductive images from journalism, politics, TV dramas, and comedy, internet memes, marketing. So most previous attempts to address this issue focus on one or two particular genres of representation to construct an argument for inherent bias and negative stereotyping. And since 9/11, disciplines like sociology, political science, anthropology, religious studies, history have all been brought into play to explore the supposed schism by which relations between Islam and the West and the place of Muslims in the West have been violently reconfigured. Our interest was in attempting to produce an interdisciplinary understanding of the representation of Muslims in the diaspora, both by various mainstream media and by those invested with the power to speak from within on behalf of a notionally homogenous set of interests. So for the title of our book, we deliberately chose a provocatively worded phrase framing, building on a term of reference from sociology and communication studies. The original use of frames and framing as we employ the terms come from the Canadian sociologist, pressed the wrong video, wrong button, from sociology and communication studies. The original use of frames and framing as we employ the terms came from the Canadian sociologist Irving Goffman. Irving Goffman saw the, I'm just trying to see if I can get my next slide up for you. Yeah, I think that's it, sorry. Saw human interactions as essentially symbolic, hence the term for the school of sociology he's most associated with, symbolic interactionism. Taking a sort of dramaturgical approach, Goffman talked about how we present ourselves in our everyday life, take on context-appropriate roles, and rely on the recognition and reciprocation of our performance from others in a social script that is strongly policed. For Goffman, frames are the ways in which we organize experience and give a shape to events. So frames operate to provide a series of ready-made filters through which everyday life and interactions can be made meaningful. In frame analysis, Goffman argues that given their understanding of what it is that is going on, individuals fit their actions to this understanding and ordinarily find that the ongoing world supports this fitting. This is the frame that we deal with in our book, Framing Muslims. It is a space opened up, or I should say more accurately, closed down by certain modes of representation. Such representations are then in turn interpreted according to a wider socio-political frame lent salience by the way it supports a narrative about Muslims' essential difference from us. As Maxwell McCombs has described it in relation to news media, the frame is the central organizing idea for news content that supplies a context and suggests what the issue is through the use of selection, emphases, exclusion, and elaboration. They suggest what is relevant and irrelevant, at the same time promoting certain types of approved interpretation and response. So we argue that the twin concepts of stereotyping and framing are applicable beyond the boundaries of individual practices, taking different forms in different media, but always staking out the territory within which Muslimness and Muslim issues are recognized and valorized. And it's important to say that such framing structures are as prevalent, although subtler, in supposedly liberal media as they are in the most predictably hostile conservative tabloids. In reportage, for instance, things to look for, as much the context in which print news stories are set, are the juxtaposition of headline, narrative, accompanying photograph, the cropping of the photograph, and wider debates to which they refer as raw content. So rather than being descriptive and neutral when it comes to Muslims, we see stories about them almost always contained within a framing narrative, the parameters of which are defined by questions of belonging, otherness, and threat. This is true even in those good news stories about Muslims being brave or public-spirited. So such good Muslim stories serve as a supposed corrective to the predominant bad, irrational, strange Muslim stories. But as stories, they actually reinforce the frame by responding in the terms dictated by the negative stereotype in the first place. They are the exceptions that prove the rule that Muslims as a whole are untrustworthy to speak. So unfortunately, while things have moved on in the 10 years since we wrote our book, and there's certainly a greater variety of Muslim self-expression out there, what's sad to say and see is that the frame nonetheless remains tenacious. And there's no better example of this than the recent, the infamous, it's not recent anymore, infamous February 4 interview between Emma Barnett, the presenter of BBC Radio 4's iconic Women's Hour programme, and Zara Mohammed, the new and at 29 years of age, the youngest ever head of the UK's largest umbrella body for Muslims, the Muslim Council of Britain. Much press attention was paid to the hostile framing of the interview, hostile tone of the interview, with Emma Barnett interrupting Zara Mohammed on several occasions. To understand the framing here, we need also to consider how the questions follow an unstated but clear pre-existing agenda of framing Muslims. They rely on certain unacknowledged but strongly assumed comparative connections, each of which is taken to redound to the disadvantage of Muslims. Barnett's strategy has 5 identifiable parts, corresponding to aspects of the frame. She begins by asking how many female imams there are. In this, Barnett overtly and mistakenly assumes a relevant comparison between the roles of imams and those of priests and rabbis in Christianity and Islam. This is fundamentally to misrecognize the clerical setup in Islam, where the role of religious authority is different. And she says, it's striking you can't answer the question, and she's chiding as if some religious oversight should be part of Zara Mohammed's role. This response also misleadingly brands the MCB as a group with some sort of purchase over religious practices, when it's actually a broad umbrella organization for Muslims with their many varieties of doctrines and practices, and from many different diaspora groups, plus converts too, of course. The second frame is that of extremism. Here, Barnett produces a quotation from a so-called moderate Muslim writing in the right-wing periodical, The Spectator magazine, which has, sorry, just changing my slide quickly, which has a significant history of publishing Islamophobic authors and essays to accuse the MCB of trying to silence certain shades of opinion. During an answer where Mohammed emphasizes her desire to bring more young people and women on board, Barnett interrupts again with a loaded question that assumes that what holds Muslim women back from public participation must be, and I quote, ultra-conservatism within Islam and local communities, or a general issue with patriarchy. So here are 2 framing themes for the price of 1. Inwardness and misogyny. Actually, Mohammed sidesteps that trap very well by turning the focus onto other possible causes, such as socioeconomic barriers and the need to talk to employers. She doesn't mention that it has been statistically proven that job applicants with Muslim names fare worse than other groups, whether they are women or not. This is where the discussion gets more tetchy, with Barnett determined to force home the frame argument that women are excluded from full social participation through some fault of the community. Mohammed responds by observing that Barnett's questions seek to define us, a point I'll return to in a moment. The last 2 frames are macro-political. Barnett asks why the government refuses to engage with the MCB. Mohammed diplomatically refuses to be drawn. In fact, in Framing Muslims, we talk about how the MCB, since its establishment in the 1990s, has always provided a target whereby successive governments of different political persuasions have been able to browbeat and express their frustrations with what they see as a homogenous and intractable singular Muslim community. The MCB were wooed by the Blair government at the time of the attacks on Afghanistan and Iraq, and subsequently shunned and punished when they failed to bring Muslim communities on side with these imperialist adventures. They were further excluded when a senior member expressed anti-Semitic sentiments, and this unofficial ban on government engagement with the MCB remains in place despite the offending person being expelled and their views repudiated. Um, I'm kind of not going to play you the clip because that'll be take up more time. So I'll just continue. The last framing moment concerns Muslim-Jewish relations. Obviously, there are international flashpoints at play here, such as the unresolved Israel-Palestine issue. Yet the story of Muslim-Jewish relations in the UK is also one of interfaith and intercommunity cooperation. A previous head of the MCB, Dr. Shuja Shafi, once told Peter and I the story of how both communities had come together to oppose one particular piece of scurrilous anti-Muslim journalism. This was because they realized as minorities they needed to stick together. So Barnett's deployment of the idea of a, quote, troubled relationship between Judaism and Islam, unquote, seems decontextualized. Is it relevant in the UK? If it is, that might be because of the comparatively new populist political tactic of attempting to play off communities against one another for political gain. In the last election, Labour were repeatedly accused of anti-Semitism, both by voices within the party critical of the then leader Jeremy Corbyn and by his conservative and right-wing tabloid opponents. At the same time, Labour accused the Conservatives of Islamophobia after a string of anti-Muslim comments and tweets were discovered among party activists and candidates for office. Here, for the first time, was an apparent attempt to factionalize minority groups. Labour were tarred as the party who was soft on Muslim extremism at home and excused it in other parts of the world, part of their supposed lack of patriotism. The Tories were accused of being institutionally Islamophobic. Michael Gove even described Boris Johnson's victory as a relief for Britain's Jewish community. This last frame, slipped in from nowhere, represents the newest and possibly most insidious aspect of the framing of Muslims. Not only are they a danger to the culture, traditions, beliefs, and practices of the true British, that mythical category beloved by racists, refashioned by populism, and cemented in the eyes of some by Brexit, they are also a threat to other minorities too. So these are the micro elements of the frame. But framing never only operates on one level. You have to think about the macro frames within which the micro frames operate. Here, these have to do with the conventions of broadcast interviewing, where the editor and program presenter dictate the topics, the pace, and the endpoint of conversations. Any departure from this is seen as unacceptable and vigorously resisted. To me, that's why Mohammed's complaint that Barnett was seeking to define us through her questions touched such a raw nerve. Barnett took issue with it as if it's a personal affront. This relates to the bigger contest over how knowledge about Muslims should work in 2021. This is the overarching frame within which everything else sits. If we add to this the rise of a brand of populist politics, which, as Jan Werner Müller points out, repudiates the old assumption of governing for all the people, allowing populists to arrogate to themselves the right to define who the people are against those who are deemed interlopers or traitors for not endorsing the populist agenda. And what emerges is a disturbing snapshot of a tendency in contemporary British politics. This populism has played out in many ways, most recently in the protests over Palestine. These populist politics are not unique in Britain. We have seen the global strategies of Donald Trump in the past, Narendra Modi in India, and closer to home playing out in Europe. A recent example is the March 7th referendum in Switzerland, propped up by the right-wing National Conservative Swiss People's Party over Muslim women wearing the burqa and niqab in public places. This was won by a narrow majority in a country where Muslims make up around 5% of the Swiss population of 8.6 million, most of whom have their roots in Turkey, Bosnia, and Kosovo. The ban doesn't apply to face coverings worn for health reasons in the pandemic. So this type of populist politics has contributed to the SVP's electoral gains in the past. And of course, we're seeing sort of stuff going on with Marine Le Pen in France. In Britain, the stereotype and reality that persists for Muslim women is that of jihadi brides or victims of Islamist regimes who need saving. There are highly contentious cases in which young Muslim girls have come to serve as examples of what happens when you don't obey the law. Legal cases from the Luton schoolgirls' right to wear the jilbab to Denbigh High School to the more recent cancellation of Shamima Begum's citizenship after she left Bethnal Green in East London to join IS, travelling via Turkey to Syria, are two such cases. My own work has interpreted the veil from transnational, global and national lens from the majority perspective of Islamic nationalism in Pakistan and the minority lens of Muslims in Britain. Feminist methodology, intersectional approaches and decolonial praxis has informed how I interrogate the concept of agency across languages and cultures. In the aftermath of 9/11, I was asked to write about the experience of Afghan women, something that I felt somewhat uncomfortable doing in the media storm that we were in at the moment in time. And also I felt there was a more urgent story, which was about Muslims in the media ghetto, that I needed to write. The point here is that Muslim women's issues regularly make up global media headlines, reiterating a universalist narrative of oppression. This is not to say that some of these concerns that come out of experiences of women in Muslim countries are based on unrealities. They are truths to the claims made, as they are in the diaspora. But it is how their stories are framed and become the frame narratives around which recognition of the other takes place in multicultural societies that is of concern. To give you one final example, this framing can be thought of in relation to the well-known figure of the Nobel laureate Malala Yousafzai, whose face, I do have the slide, if I can put it up for you. Oh, sorry, that was the Swiss slide, and this is. Whose face on the cover of Vogue magazine this month represents a self-conscious fashion industry translating an Islamic identity and social activism related to education on its cover. Malala represents the exemplary diasporic Muslim woman integrated into British society, preserving her cultural values, but at the same time speaking out against the oppression of women through familial arranged marriages. She is enabled to speak confidently of her own understanding of love without fear of reprisal from the community. This has caused considerable outrage in her home country, Pakistan, especially for those who wish to tie Muslim identity politics to the bodies of women. She has to contend with accusations of betrayal and inauthenticity when it comes to the Islamic nation she comes from. When her autobiography, I Am Malala, was published, it was banned in many private schools in Pakistan. Fatma Bhutto, the writer and niece of former Pakistani Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, suggested that underneath the bile and vitriol toward Malala, quote, is a genuine concern that this extraordinary girl's courageous and articulate message will be colonized by one power or other for its own insidious agendas, unquote. Malala does not live in Pakistan. In fact, it is difficult for her to go there given her profile. Malala's life experiences have led her to higher education at one of the most elite and sought-after universities, Oxford. She is a prized member of the UK Diaspora, which has given her the power to say, and I quote from the interview in Vogue, "The headscarf is a cultural symbol for us Pashtuns, so it represents where I come from. And Muslim girls or Pashtun girls or Pakistani girls, when we follow our traditional dress, we're considered to be oppressed or voiceless or living under patriarchy. I want to tell everyone that you can have your own voice within your culture and you can have equality in your culture." Now, to be able to say this, Malala has gone through the experience of writing and publishing a blog as a young girl under a pseudonym for the BBC when the Taliban had occupied the Swat Valley. This propelled her in the limelight, and she was shot in the head by the Taliban for her outspoken views. She and her family have a new life in Birmingham. She is an international spokesperson for girls' education from Africa to Asia and is the youngest Nobel Peace Prize winner. My question is, what is the exceptional life that is required from Muslim women before they are given the opportunities that they truly deserve? Not everyone has the resilience of Malala, and neither do they have gatekeepers who will protect them. She says in her Nobel lecture that hers is not an exceptional life. And I quote, "I tell my story not because it is unique, because it is not. It is the story of many girls. I am not a lone voice. I am many." The frame that determines her life story is a unique one. So in conclusion, the frame analysis of gender and diaspora shows us that there are some very serious issues that continue to place Muslim communities on the margins of Western society, including the politics of populism. The hostile environment toward immigration, refugees, and a mistrust of Muslims in the Conservative Party translates itself through mainstream channels. It has the effect of making communities insular and inward-looking places to be mined for information. Women, families, and LGBTQ+ communities demand a more inclusive approach that is resistant to frame narratives that racialize and discriminate. A structural and decolonized approach that is attentive to framing can help to foster new narratives of community building and dialogue for intercultural, transnational futures. Thank you.